Well, Thomas, it's a new year. It's 2023. And with that is our first podcast of the new year. Welcome, everybody, to the SumerSports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, did you do anything fun over the New Year's, or you mostly chill at home? Like, what does the New Year's look like for Thomas Dimitroff?
For the ex-GM, Thomas Dimitroff, let's just call it the way it is. Yeah, it's funny because I'm so used to going to practices and flying away on holidays the day before and such. So this allowed me, honestly, to be around my kids, which has been great, my family. So I've taken it all in. It's been good. Watched quite a bit of football as you have, and looking forward to talking today about a position that I'm very passionate about. So here we go.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a position. Yeah, let's just cut to it because we try to keep these to 45 minutes or so. And we do want to preview tonight's game because I do think that tonight's game is one of the best of the whole season, and possibly a preview of a playoff game in the AFC. So let's just get straight to it because I do think that this is a thing where we talked about edge. We talked about edge being kind of a solid position to a certain extent, not perfectly, of course. Defensive tackle a little harder because there's more variation, but still a position where I think folks have a pretty good gauge on who's good and who's not. We had linebacker where I think I kind of conceded that, some of the analytical approaches to the position have not necessarily borne the best fruit at the position. And, plenty of places where folks, can really, do a good job when it comes to, scouting can really enhance the position. Now we get to corner where I think we probably have done from an analytical standpoint, the worst job of being able to capture who's good and who's not. And traditional scouting on the one hand has also, it's been weird. Like over the past 5 to 6 years, cornerback in the first round has actually generated the highest rate of first round picks to actually earn their 5th-year option. But it's also a position where you've seen like Tremaine Johnson get a big contract and 2 franchise tags, and you've seen a ton of misevaluations at the position. So it's one where I think both the analytical side and the traditional side have warts. Is that, Thomas, just a part of how difficult it is to play that position in this league?
Well, there's no question that it's difficult. There are so many layers to it as far as the complications of it, the coverage, the ability to stay in phase and move athletically and run. There are just so many. There are so many things you're dealing with. So yes, I do believe that. I do believe, though, it's also like defensive end, like the rush man, the quarterback. People want and need corners, and they make a lot of mistakes on corners. They push corners thinking that they're not only going to get the athlete, but then they also have character elements that they're dealing with. I'm just throwing this out as another element that people think will deal with that because all we need is a shutdown guy. And I've learned over my years, we've pulled some pretty darn good corners and teams I've been around and with, and we've had some really good corners in those spots, but we've also had corners in those spots and defenses that were subpar. To your article, and I can't wait to talk about those pieces because it's so true. I always thought I need myself 2 marquee corners, shutdowns. When we had, Trufant and Alford, we thought we were going to roll with that. And unfortunately, that didn't last for a long time, which is another point of the conversation. So yes, very, very complicated position. Takes a lot of work and a lot of nuance to understand it, I think.
Yeah, and it's changed so much, right? Because I think, when you look back at, well, for one, I think what you're talking about is absolutely true. Like the athlete that you need to be to play corner, the mentality that you have to play corner is going to give rise to 2 things that really make evaluation difficult, right? The first one is the mental makeup required to play corner is maybe not the most conducive to, like you have to kind of be brash. You have to kind of be somebody who can take failure with in stride because you are going to get beat a lot. And the benefit of the difference between a really good corner and a mediocre corner and a bad corner is like getting beat 4 times a game versus getting beat 5 times a game. And so like that kind of thing is, really tough because that brashness you need. I think of like in Kansas City, like Marcus Peters was amazing at like, doing some freestyling stuff and coming off of his own player to get interceptions and really be a playmaker for that team. But when it went sour for him, it really went sour for him. And that kind of mentality is tough to maintain in a reasonable way. And so I just think that, it's tough from that perspective, and that's not an analytically driven thing. And then additional to that, I feel like it's the closest position to track and field where you almost always have to be at your physical peak to be a good corner because of all the things, the reactions that you have to have, the running both forward and backward, and then obviously the agility you need. Like injuries, I think, affect cornerback performance as much, if not more, than any other position in the entire league because the movements that you make are almost entirely mimicking the movements of the player you're playing, as opposed to, for example, if you're a wide receiver and you have an injury to one leg, you might only be able to run certain routes. You can't do that if you're a corner because you got to be able to cover all the routes. So I think that those are two things that really hurt cornerback eval because it's just two things that affect it are so important, but it's not anything we've really gotten our hands on so far analytically. But 15 years ago, you only had to play two corners at a time, right? And for the most part. And you brought in, oftentimes it'd be another safety. Sometimes it'd be a smaller guy to play the nickel. And usually those smaller guys were kind of like failed outside corners. Now, in the modern defense, you're playing three corners almost all the time. And the player that plays in the slot is a starter for you. Like, how has that part of the evaluation changed as well? Having to basically scout for an entirely new NFL position.
Yeah, I mean, it's three starters, just like, quite honestly, it's three starters at your receiver position because you need a bona fide inside guy and you need your two outside guys. So, yeah, I think over the years it's been interesting to see how that third corner and the third starter at corner has changed. And I remember back in the day when we were playing with the Patriots, we were playing with midliners at very best in that third and that nickel spot. And we got away with it because, Bill's system was so sort of focused on, really honing in on the intelligence of the corner as well. Because you could have someone in that spot, at least in Bill's defense back then. Belichick's defense was really, really, as long as you knew where you were going and you had a really good awareness and a sort of anticipatory element to you, you were going to make plays and you were going to dissuade people from throwing in that area. In today's world, man, you better have the hips, you better have the quick twitch, you better have the feet, you better have the burst alongside with your two outside guys who are your hopefully your shutdown guys. It's become really, really, it's such an interesting position. Again, there are so many elements and nuances to it, which I want to talk about. I also want to talk about this, Eric. If you don't know as an organization exactly what you're getting and how you're going to play the corners, I look back on the day when we acquired Dunta Robinson. You remember that name. Dunta, obviously, we acquired him from the Texans, and we paid a lot of money for him and loved him. Tough, in-your-face, tough-ass guy. Loved the way he played, but he was an in-your-face guy. We tried to play him back, unfortunately, like an off corner. And there's a difference there, right? You can still be a big time corner, but if you're not if you're not adept at playing off and you get out of phase often when you're off as an off cover corner, man, just like your article said, which I can't wait for you to articulate and expound on, is that can be a very sort of opening within your defense that these really, really smart offenses can pick apart. And that could be a really good corner, but if he's not adept at doing something, they're going to pick you apart in that situation. So I want to talk about that, and we can swing back around, meaning you have to be on the same wavelength with your not only head coach, but what your D coordinator and how he's going to put that corner in the spot to be the best that he can be is really, really important.
Yeah, we got some great questions, from our listeners. One of them was this whole scheme and fit kind of idea. This whole how do these pieces play together? And so you were talking about this article I sent in the show notes. This was an article called "How Fragile Is Defense?" A look into weak link systems. You can look at it at Pro Football Focus. I wrote that article in March of 2020, and it's really funny because, and not funny because, it was that time of the world's history, but like, we were at the NFL scouting combine and I was thinking about Jeff Okudah because at the time he was going to be the number 3 overall pick and consensus, he's been pretty good for the Lions, but the issue that I had, we were talking in a room and I was like, I think coverage is more valuable as a whole than pass rush, but it's not as easy to sort of turn around and say, well, that means a corner is more valuable than an edge, because it's not actually how this thing works, right? Like, and the way I thought about it was it's this idea of weak link systems. Like if you would, like, before pandemics, and this was on my mind because my prior career, I was a mathematical biologist and I studied diseases, I studied vaccine efficacy, and and the idea was, it doesn't matter. You and I could take all the shots in the world, right? And we could, and vaccines could be as they can work as well as anybody says. They can have 100% efficacy. But if there are 2 or 3 people who don't take the measles vaccine in your kid's class, then an outbreak can happen. And even an outbreak can happen to people who have the measles vaccine because, the efficacy isn't 100%. And so, my thought was like, okay, from a football standpoint, do you want to use your premium draft capital to get one shutdown corner, right? A very good corner, if that cornerback is going to come at the expense of your nickel, if he's going to come at the expense of your second guy or of your safeties and linebackers. And so I went into the data and I looked, if you look at all your coverage players on a team, so you look at your 6 coverage, you take a dime defense and you look at, ranking your secondary players from 1 to 6, generally speaking, your efficiency on defense during a game is more correlated to your weaker players, your 4th, 5th, and 6th guys, and sometimes your 3rd guy, than your top 2 guys. And so that means that if you are spending a lot of cash and a lot of capital to acquire guys 1 and 2, the more additional, resources you pound into that thing, it comes at diminishing returns, because it oftentimes is going to come at the expense of your nickel or your dime safety or your second weakest safety, or so on and so forth. And that's kind of what we've seen. Like, injuries can affect you so much. You look in the betting markets, for example, cluster injuries are a thing that move lines, like not like one corner being hurt, but 3 or 4 corners being hurt. And that really affects you there. And so that takes team building to sort of a different notion than it was before, where you really wanted to get a shutdown guy. Now it's more like, well, actually you want to get maybe a few guys and play the numbers game.
Yeah, I mean, I look back and all I ever wanted was, again, a shutdown guy through 2008, all on the way. Look, we did it. We did it with our movement towards Dante Robinson, thinking we had someone there. We moved up to get Desmond Trufant, and we thought he was a very good corner. He had his ups and downs, of course. He had some injuries here and there, but in general, he was I thought a very good corner with a lot of ability. Honestly, one of the best workouts that I've ever had with a corner, as far as explosiveness, spin, turn and run, make plays, in the workout, which is a whole other thing I want to talk to you about as well, because you can get starstruck by some of the movement on these guys and the burst. And then you think, wow. And I alluded to it a couple sessions ago when I said, yeah, but if they don't have the ball skills and they don't have the ability to make the play on the ball, all of that could be for naught. So I think about that. And then I think about, even AJ Terrell and my, sort of my final go around there in Atlanta. I like him a lot. I still think I think he's a really good football player with a lot of upside. But to your point, how many times we looked at it over the years, started and thought it would be nice to have 3 or 4 of these guys that were at a good plus range, right? A 6+ range, versus fiddling with people that are 4s and 5s. Again, bear with me, 4 being average, 5 being adequate. You have too many of those, and you have these really, really smart offensive coordinators picking them apart. And that's the way it is. But I go back to when Dan Quinn came to us. He came from Seattle, and I remember we talked a lot about this. They got away with some corners, even one of their best corners and one of the best corners in a long time. He was a long levered, we call it, corner who came out of Stanford. We all know who I'm talking about. And he made a ton of money in the league. But he was a guy that was able to run with people deep but they had a defense and a scheme that was set up that would help benefit them. And they weren't just out there, trying to mirror and stay in phase. It was a very different approach.
Yeah.
And I thought they did a great job with it. We tried to do it in Atlanta when Dan came and it didn't work. We drafted a guy out of LSU, of course, and ended up, it was a really bad move for us, which you're about ready to say something. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I think, no, I mean, you bring up, Quinn, those cover 3 defense in Seattle bring a lot of lessons with them, right? Like, not only, when you think about their team building, they never went and said, Earl Thomas was a first-round pick in Carroll's first year, but, Cam Chancellor was a late-round pick. Richard Sherman was late-round pick. Byron Maxwell wasn't exactly a guy they paid a lot to. Walter Thurman was just a guy. And ultimately they played the or game, right? So I think a lot of these things in terms of gambling, like if you tell me, okay, I have 5 starters in the secondary and I have no depth, then the gamble I'm making is that all 5 guys are going to be good enough. That is a parlay, and parlays rarely hit, right? But if you tell me, and again, I'm going to briefly talk about Seattle, but I also want to talk about Cincinnati, who plays tonight. When Seattle played against New England in the Super Bowl in 2014, Jeremy Lane, their nickel, got injured. He broke his arm on an interception of Brady. Well, that turned Byron Maxwell from being a pretty good outside corner in that scheme, he ultimately failed where he went other places. But in that scheme, again, this is part of the whole thing. He could have been a football player. They took Maxwell inside in that game and had him play in the slot, a longer lever guy. And Julian Edelman had a little bit of a day that day. They put Tharold Simon, a 6'3", special teams guy. He had to play outside corner for the balance of that game when they had a 10-point lead against Brady. And ultimately, now you think about the secondary, not only one injury to Jeremy Lane weakens not one position, but 2 positions, because somebody's got to replace him in the nickel, and then somebody's got to replace the nickel guy in the outside. So it's like one injury in these weak link systems actually becomes 2. And that to me is and that happens on the offensive line too. If your left tackle gets hurt and your left guard's got to play left tackle, then you're weaker at 2 positions. So the secondary, much like the offensive line, is a weak link system in that you have some players who are force multipliers in that their existence can make a guy like a Byron Maxwell play the one position he's good at, right? And then force other things to happen. We'll talk about the Patriots with Stephon Gilmore and how I think Belichick kind of hacks the system a little bit. But back to the Bengals, who played tonight, by the way, one of the, I think, best games of the season. The Bengals in Pro Football Outsiders DVOA were 30th defensively in 2019. Mm-hmm. Zach Taylor comes in. They're 27th in 2020, so not good at all. This is who the Bengals have acquired to play in their secondary since 2020 in that secondary. Trey Waynes, who had 53 starts for the Vikings. Von Bell, who had 45 starts for the Saints. Chidobe Awuzie, who had 42 starts for the Cowboys. Mike Hilton, who was a nickel but played 59 games for Steelers. Eli Apple had 48 starts for the Giants and Saints. Trey Flowers had 40 starts for the Seahawks. Ricardo Allen, one of your success stories, in my opinion, 76 starts for the Falcons. Vernon Hargreaves had 57 starts for the Texans and Bucks. So that you go there. Now, Thomas, none of those. Trey Waynes is the first-round pick, and he got the most money of those guys. He was the least successful of those guys when playing in Cincinnati. The guys that everybody thinks sucks, like Eli Apple and Chidobe Awuzie, they ended up being the guys that won. And the Bengals, instead of having to make an and parlay, right, all 5 of these guys need to work, they said, no, we're going to take 10 guys and hope that 5 of those 10, I don't give a crap who they are, work out of those. And to me, that ends up being Trey Waynes might be the guy that gets hurt, doesn't play well. Trey Flowers might not be the guy, right? But some subset of 5 of those guys was good enough for them to increase to 19th in DVOA last year, 14th this year. Now, they did take and say, okay, we're going to get Cam Taylor-Britt in round 2 this year, Dax Hill in this year. But Dax Hill was drafted to be a backup to Jesse Bates and Von Bell. They're not even drafting guys who need to play right away. And that is, when you take that secondary and you build the group, it's really hard to fail, even if any one of those guys isn't particularly great. And Jesse Bates is a great player, but if any one of those guys isn't particularly great, it still is going to build a great secondary. And I think that is one of the reasons they've had success.
I was amazed when you showed me that because, again, in the show notes, I was thinking, I do respect Duke Tobin a lot. I mean, though he's not the I guess he's not the general manager there, but he should be. I think he should be a general manager in this league. Raised the way that he was with his dad, and been around football forever, has a really sound understanding of evaluating and putting teams together. And I look at that group, and let's talk a little bit about their finances. I know you probably have it near you, or you can pull it up on your buddy's site there, because I know it's right in front of us. But when I look at that and I think, okay, their highest paid corner or defensive back in that group was who? I think it was a $12 million contract, right?
Yeah, they paid Jesse Bates the franchise tag, right? And then Trey Waynes was a $14 million per year deal in 2020, and he didn't play in 2021 because of an injury. 2020, I'm sorry, because of an injury, and he only played sparingly in 21. And when he did, he didn't have a particularly solid year. The highest paid guys are the defensive linemen on that team, right? Yeah. Trey Hendrickson, DJ Reader. You have to get down to Chidobe Awuzie at $8 million before this season before you get to any player who in that secondary is making even reasonable money. And $8 million is like 40% of the top end deal. Like that's almost nothing.
It's almost nothing. And that's where I'm going with it. I mean, back to thinking, wow, I want to get the best here and I want to pay the most money, and then have a whole bunch of also rans that, finishing off our group. And the reality there is I think they've done a really strategic job in not just tossing a ton of money around, and by being smart, like you said. I mean, and you look at these guys, whether you believe the rankings at PFF or not, as we've said before, you can go beyond that. These aren't great football players at this point in their career, but they're playing well together. They have really good experience. And I've seen that. I've been around organizations where that has been the case, back to some of the Belichickian days, some of the Patriot days, versus some of the days that I thought we had much better talent on the Falcons and we never pulled it together. In 16, of course we did, but we didn't. And it gets frustrating. So I am 100% in line with what you're saying. We haven't even begun to talk about, breaking down a corner, which I'd like to do a little bit of, meaning what we're truly looking for in a corner, because like the linebacker position, but even more so, trying to figure out the pure coverage skills of a corner is vital. Covering, being able to cover run or defend the run and come up and support the run is, just so everyone knows, it's part of it, but you would take the excellent cover guy and an adequate run support guy any day. You just would. Yeah. And I know it gets frustrating for the fan base sometimes, and the listeners, to look at that and think, oh, the guy just got run over. And it's frustrating for me as a GM, but in the end, if they're not making plays on balls, man, we have no chance at all.
Yeah, for sure. So because for me, when I'm looking, obviously I'm looking at the drills. I'm looking at the 40-yard dash, agility, whether they're explosive. So you look at the broad jump and stuff. One of the things that is controversial in football analytics is, do you use some target statistics? So for example, I like the signing of James Bradberry by the Eagles this year. The Giants had to cut him. He was a very good corner in 20. He had fallen off in 21. And then in 22, he's obviously been really good for Philadelphia, really good value signing. I feel like because the coverage statistics are almost entirely who you play, there are some offenses that shy away from the great corners, and there are some offenses that go at the great corners. And there are the league is designed that if you're a great corner and you're up against a great wide receiver, you're not going to win every rep, right? And so, there are going to be some great corners that have, like when Bradberry played for the Carolina Panthers, as you know very well, his division had Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley. I can't remember if Roddy White was, still in the league at that point, but you had Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Deshaun Jackson for a moment there. You also had the Saints guys with Michael Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders and guys like that. So he's putting his opponents were so much better. So his coverage statistics were really poor. So and in any market, and I'll let you talk about, your expertise here, but in any market, when people poorly measure something, there is value in buying the dip, right? And the dip on Bradberry was he was poor last year in man coverage for the Giants, as measured by PFF and as measured by coverage statistics. But he had anybody who evaluated James Bradberry as a corner, as you would, knew that he had the goods to him. And so there was clearly a way to exploit that marketplace in the last offseason.
So when we talk about corners, and those are again really good points, and I've told you many times. I mean, we definitely keep the idea in mind that you can have all of this great movement. You can again backpedal well. This comes back to what we've said from the very beginning, from snap to whistle. Your ability to on the coverage side to be fluid in your movement, to be able to again, remember it's a matchup league, everyone. So the ability to be in phase is huge, just like we said on any other cover positions. Even more so, of course, as a corner, especially when you're an outside corner. Being able to again flip your hips, fluidly and recover. Whether it's jamming your foot in the ground and breaking on the ball, your BOB needs to be really acute. You can't be a rounder. You can't be rounding out and taking extra steps even if you are a long levered guy, like some of the players out there that you see today that you think, wow, there's no way that this guy's such a big corner, but you get him out in a man-to-man situation where one of these really adept receivers can separate on one of these corners and flip him inside out, then you have no chance. So this comes back to making sure that you're putting these corners in the right spot. But that ability to man cover is one element of it, of course, how he breaks on the ball skills. And that's different, by the way, than hands, right? We've had people who had good ball skills, make plays on the ball, jump, they're able to track the ball. And it's funny. I was looking on PFF today. They don't have that. You guys call them stops. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are pass breakups there. And there are also like, and I don't know if this is on like their, consumer thing, but there are pass breakups there. If you look at, some of the coverage grades, but even then, like, I think it's weird sort of what they end up calling it. So if you look at PBU, that's basically where you're going to look. And, the interesting thing is to no one's surprise, Sauce Gardner's leading the league at corner with 14 of those. But then it's a little bit of a tricky one after that. It's, Darius Williams of Jacksonville, formerly of LA, Michael Davis of the Chargers, Carlton Davis, Trevon Diggs, DJ Reed are having good years, and the aforementioned James Bradbury at 10. So there are, you do have that, statistic there. It's interesting. You bring up a couple things, and I want to take this to where we can marry your expertise and what's available now. So when Pro Football Focus started, there was no such thing as tracking data. Now, vendors like StatsBomb, telemetry and Sports Logic and stuff, they're getting tracking data, right? I'm thinking of like two things you could do, right? Like looking at how a player flips his hips, right? Could really, you can measure that, right? You could look at the orientation of a player and look at how long it takes him on a certain type of route to turn around completely and how fast he accelerates out of that. That is, for the analysts that are looking, for things to do, that's something you can measure. Another one is what you just said, like how much, so we talk about this with linebackers, how much ground do you cover on the running back after the handoff? The next one you could talk about is when the pass is thrown, right? And you can adjust for velocity of throw, you can adjust for route run. How much ground do you cover on the receiver? You start with this much separation at the ball being thrown. You can measure that, and how much separation happens at the catch point. And you could sort of like, say how good is a corner at that. I think it's obviously, the interesting one is you breaking on the ball is a great skill, but as we talked about before, it's kind of like soccer. If a team is throwing at you, that's a signal that you're giving up at least some sort of opening to them.
Yeah, and we've seen people who can do all of what we're saying here. And what I want to make sure I articulate is it can look really eye-catching, not only from the athleticism, but the speed, the quickness, the reactionary athleticism that we oftentimes use with defensive players, being able to mirror. And if you're not making the play on the ball, if you're not adept, if you don't have the anticipatory skills that is warranted in the NFL, all of that is for naught in my mind, because big plays happen around you, and then you obviously get yourself in a lot of troubles. Now, there are other guys out there, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, who may not be possessive of all those really eye-catching skills and movement, but they have a really keen eye. I always go back to this guy and not even know who this person is. There's a guy who played for the Dallas Cowboys years and years ago named Everson Walls. Everson was, ostensibly a 4'8", 40 guy. Can you imagine? Big old dude, of course.
Well, that was like Otis Smith, right? Otis Smith was another 4'8" kind of guy that you had in New England, right? Back in the day.
Right, exactly. But smart as a whip, really adept, really just had the anticipation and the awareness of what was going on and made a ton of plays and bailed us out left, right, and center, of course. There was a versatility element to some of these guys. So we often go in, and just so everyone knows, so like when we're setting up our draft board or we're setting up our free agency board, we will back-to-back, is what we call them, basically back-to-back evaluate the 5 or 8 that we have positioned, and we really try to work that draft board or the free agent board, and we start massaging it as we watch, and we hone in on every element of the metric tree that we want to be able to differentiate those top 5 or 10 corners, for instance. And it's a long, ongoing process. And there are people in this league who have, in the NFL, who have really, really sharp, sort of acute vision and understanding of the movement of these guys, and they're really dialed in on it. And they can differentiate the athleticism between, the first corner in the group and the 5th corner very, very well. And I think, to me, that's an art, and it takes a lot of time. But in the end, you can put that guy up on your board who is your top movement guy and project, Eric. We've done that before, where we think this guy's upside is going to be so great, and yet his production was not as high as it should have been, whether it was for another pro team or whether it was in the NCAA before coming. That becomes complicated because you're like, wow, this guy's a 4.2 or a 4.35. He only had, 14 or 13 PBUs through his entire career. You start looking at all the statistics that you think back in the day that were important for us, and there are so many more layers there that I'm hoping people like us at SumerSports can take it to a completely different level. Take the really good eye general manager who can differentiate between all of these players, and then attach what you're going to do and supplement that very good GM with the ability to take all of those really cool analytics and apply them.
Yeah, and I always thought, so this was a project that I did with my colleague Timo Riske at PFF. This was a paper we submitted to Sloan. And it's funny, like, for anybody who's talking about Sloan, like, I thought this was our best paper. It was the one that got like placed the least in that competition. So whatever. But like one of the things you can look at, and I think this will help in evaluation, is how much field is this player controlling? So you can look at the history of the data, and you look at the field and look at the routes that are being run. And, you can basically triangulate the field, whether you're using Javi Fernandez and Luke Bourne, of Zealous, have done this for soccer. We did a little bit of it for football, where you're basically looking and saying, like, what's the likelihood that this player owns this part of the field? And what I found when I did that research was, that is more stable characteristic than, PFF grades and pass breakups and all that. And it reveals types, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about predictability in a second here, but it reveals types. So when I looked at the New England defense at the very end of the Stephon Gilmore era, what I noticed was you had Gilmore, he'd be responsible for more space on the field. And so then what you did was you had a tighter confined area for J.C. Jackson to home. And so then the quarterback against the New England Patriots had a tougher, so when you face the Seattle defense and all 3 of the guys had their equal thirds, it's sort of not that hard of a choice to throw to Byron Maxwell instead of Richard Sherman, because the space is equal. But if you're tasked with, do I throw to this bigger area against Stephon Gilmore, who has fabulous ball skills and great movement ability, and is still going to break up a pass even if I'm in a big part of the field? Or do I throw to a smaller part of the field against a weaker corner in J.C. Jackson? And what you saw was Gilmore was so good at being able to cover the big parts of the field that throwing his way sucked. And J.C. Jackson was good enough at breaking on the ball and good enough in those confined quarters that if you threw his way, of course, he got the interceptions and he got the $16 million deal. And then when you take Jackson out of that New England area, right? They started running different coverages in the 2021 season when he, was their only corner when Gilmore left. But then when he goes to LA, he's not quite going to live up to that contract because, again, he's allowed to, by a different player, to play corner at a high level because he's not responsible for as much, right? So that sort of is this whole looking at predictability from the player standpoint or the team standpoint, you can use something from information theory called Shannon entropy to basically say, what do we expect JC Jackson to do? Or broadly and more meta is like, what do we expect Dan Quinn to do? What do we expect Bill Belichick to do? How, can he play? This corner played in a scheme where it was very easy to predict what coverage they were playing in. So maybe his stats weren't quite as good. Whereas this corner played in a very varied scheme, but he was not the one who allowed the stuff to happen. He was not the one who allowed them to switch from 2 high to 1 high, 3, 1 high to 2 high. He was just kind of a beneficiary of all of that unpredictable nature. Like that to me is a second level of like looking at corner plays and trying to contextualize. This player's had production, but can we contextualize that production? Is he the driver of that production or is he the recipient of it?
Well, I think when you get really good coaches and head coaches and D coordinators who are not only dealing with situations where they feel in any given year that they're not thriving with, people above the top 50 with that, at that position, how they can get creative. And that comes back to what Dan and I talked about when he came from Seattle. I mean, there are ways to put your players in the best spot that they can be. To your earlier comments there, like I think that is fascinating, right? The Gilmore, when you start talking about Gilmore covering as much space as he does, being able to understand where you are. This is not just the talent that you have on your team, Eric. From any given Sunday, it is also trying to determine how are we going to deal with the injuries that we have at our corner position, because it can be sketchy, of course, right? So how we get creative with that is really important. And we can sit there and say anything we want to say about coaches out there. The head coach and the D coordinators have to be really, really creative with how they come up with their scheme, along with the talent that they have. And that's why we can sit there and do all we want to do as evaluators and bring in the best moving, best looking, stud type player. But if they're not fitting into that scheme in a certain way, then obviously you're staring down the barrel of something very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, can I ask one more question about this before we move on to preview tonight's game? Because I think this is as somebody who observes the Chiefs, right? So Kansas City used to be a team where Spagnuolo really preferred veterans, right? He had guys like Sorensen, he had guys, and like at L'Jarius Sneed got injured yesterday. There was a point in time yesterday where the Chiefs' 3 corners that were playing were all rookies. First round pick Trent McDuffie, fourth round pick Joshua Williams, and 7th round pick Jalen Watson. The Chiefs I would say Sumerified the secondary this offseason by saying, we're going to let Charvarius Ward, who was a 7th round pick himself, go and make $14 million, and he's played wonderful football for the Niners. We're going to let him go, and we're going to backfill with Brian Cook, a safety from Cincinnati in round 3, Trent McDuffie, a first rounder from Washington in round 1. I think they also wanted to get Kyle, another corner later in the draft too. And they went and got Joshua Williams out of Fayetteville, a long levered Division II corner. And then they go get Jalen Watson out of Wazoo, a great corner university in my estimation. And funny thing is, when guys got hurt early in the year, McDuffie got hurt in the first week of the season, but they had bodies, right? And they had young athletes. And they played the 7th rounder Watson before they played the 4th rounder Williams. Like, again, it was sort of this thing. But ultimately, what was very interesting was the team building by Brett Veach dictated, to some ways, the allocation of players by Steve Spagnuolo. Spags has never been a guy that ever has wanted to play young players, and yet they gave him a roster which was like that was your only choice, right? And to a certain extent, they traded Rashad Fenton to the Falcons. They cut Lonnie Johnson, who was a veteran who played for Houston. And so, because there was a question here that I think was interesting. It's sort of a little bit like, why would you bring in a corner that doesn't maximize the scheme? And I think it's more complicated than that, right? It's not, you're not being antagonistic towards the coach, and the coach isn't being antagonistic to you. But are there ways in which you can kind of do what the Chiefs did here, which was kind of dictate what is being done by the moves that you make in the front office?
So, I mean, look, this is a good question. Was it Taylor who asked that question?
Yeah. So Taylor Von Faxon, why would you bring in Dante Robinson and play him in ways that doesn't maximize his value? How's that possible to bring in corners who aren't scheme fits? Like, that's a good question. I think from the outside, somebody looks at this and says, hey, this isn't adding up. I think there are realities that you have to face as a team builder and also as a coach that maybe you can expound on here.
So shed a little bit of light on that, Taylor. So you go into this and you're like, we're going to get the best damn corner we can get. Your organization's behind you, your head coach and your D coordinator, the GM and the personnel staff, and we have it ranked. And we, come hell or high water, are getting Dante Robinson to come to the Atlanta Falcons because we deemed that he had such versatility, toughness, because he was also going to be a tough corner for us in Mike Smith's system because Mike Smitty wanted that type of guy. And we thought, which often happens, this is just the way it is in the NFL. Your coaches think that when they see the short sights, which this is the short sights of someone that they have graded as one of the very best out there, that they can coach that player out of it. So if a player's not the best, playing off, they feel like they can bring him along, put him in a scheme situation. So you end up coming together as an entire staff. And this is where people don't necessarily always understand. A general manager normally is in charge of the acquisitions, right? But he also has to listen to his head coach and his coordinator and his position coaches. I've said this before, Taylor. If you're sitting there and you're thinking about, okay, I, come hell or high water, again, using that phrase, I am going to pull the guy that I think is the best player, and I'm going to jam it down these coaches' throats no matter what, because this is what I believe. Those days are gone in the NFL. You then what happens is you might have a group of coaches who aren't necessarily behind your decision as a GM. And then what happens is your coaches aren't really all in it. And that can happen before you know it. You're playing a guy like Dante in a spot. Dante Robinson is how it's pronounced. You're playing a guy like that in a spot where he shouldn't necessarily be playing, but you're playing him there anyway. You brought him in, you got him in, and you realized we thought we could make this guy a better off corner because he had movement and this and that, but he's just not natural. You realize it after a year and you're thinking, oh my God, we either have to change our style and our approach to adapt to Dante Robinson, or we have to see if we can play him off. And it was a lot of money invested in a really touchy situation. He made big time hits for us. We loved that. But it was frustrating for our organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's reasonable, and I don't think. I mean, look, you're in the business of finding value. You're in the business of like the blue chip corner, the Marlon Humphrey that can play everything. Like you're paying for that. The guy Denzel Ward, you're paying for. I'm trying to think of Jalen Ramsey can play inside, outside, line up over a tight end, jam the tight end, play outside, neutralize number one. Like everybody already knows that guy's that guy, right? And so your job, and there are so for example, the Vikings drafted Justin Jefferson at pick 21, I believe. Justin Jefferson played 2 outside snaps at wide receiver in his final year at LSU. 2, right? So if you just went off of what he had done, then you would say, oh, he's just a slot guy. Why are we taking a big slot guy at pick 21? But it's the job of evaluators. It's the job of predictors to say, well, no, he's got the traits to play outside. He just played with Jamar Chase, one of the best players in the league. And so and Dante, when he was at Houston, played inside because that was the best fit for him. But was there a coaching reason that he wasn't playing outside? Was there another reason he wasn't playing outside that you guys could tap into and get that value? That's a swing you have to take sometimes. And you can't just be like, well, we've only seen him do this. Because the thing about corners, guys, is how many corners? Mike Hilton's an example. The Bengals have him. Mike Hilton's one of the few examples of a guy who played inside in college and played inside in the pros. Most of the guys are outside corners in college that you have to project as inside guys in the pros. And some inside guys, if you play Alabama, you play inside because you're one of the 3 best corners on the team, but you could have outside ability as well. And you're just not realizing that because the guys you're playing with are superstars. So there's a lot there. And we got a question from Twitter from Zach Rogers basically asking, what's more important, that finding the scheme or, finding the players, finding the scheme and then fitting the players to it, or fitting the players to the scheme. And I think the answer is yes. They're both important. Yeah. And I think it's, one of those things where the availability in the draft and in free agency is scant enough where you can almost never, fill that gap sufficiently every year.
It's a great point. I know we want to get on to the game here, coming around to 45, but yeah, the last thing I'd say about the corner situation, yes, we want to fit the scheme. We also want to have that player that we think is like the Julio Joneses of the defense, or when we picked AJ Terrell a little aside, I remember all of our draft meetings. I mean, that was a mixed bag of opinions. I'm talking about, and this is not disrespectful to any side, because we had the personnel people coming to the table with one idea, and the coaches looking at it from a different perspective. And there was a lot of discussion around that. And, there were people that, as you remember that year, do you remember who the corner was that went to the Jacksonville Jaguars?
CJ Anderson.
That's exactly right. And it was
CJ Anderson was a player for whom a year later, folks were asking me, hey, we want to trade for him. What's his value? And I said, a 2, a 3, maybe. Like,
right. And the difference between that and there's so we were going round and round between CJ Anderson and AJ Terrell. And in the very end, we thought an AJ Terrell would fit us much better. Not from many levels. Remember, there are many levels. It's not just the cover ability. It's the intelligence. It's the competitiveness. It's, semi-leadership stuff. It's the ability to support the run. Yes. It's the ball skills 100%. It's also the moxie. It's also the deep down passion that someone has. And you know what happened in the end when people started doing their research on what happened with CJ. That was tough, because there were some issues there that he was dealing with. And in the end, I'm a big believer in going with what you know. And I'm not. I mean, I think of the years that I was in the NFL in the position as a GM, especially when you were dealing with the defensive backs in the secondary, which I was very passionate about. There were elements to their personalities that you really, really had to dig into. And I want to throw this last one to you. Would you rather take, I call them this, would you rather take a wayward soul at the pass rush position, a la Lawrence Taylor, or at the corner position, a la whoever you want to say out there?
I would rather take a wayward soul at, I think it takes different mentalities to be a great pass rusher than it takes to be a great corner. And here's why. Corner, your losses matter. At edge, your wins matter. So if you have 40 pass rush plays in a game and you can get 8 pressures, that's a really good game. But you have 32 losses, right? And so you have to have a different mentality to play that position. If you're a corner and you play 40 plays as a coverage player and you lose 8 times, like, that's a bad game, right? So it's to me, I think you need a resilient mentality. You need, like, an edge player has to be a gambler. A corner has to be more of a more resolute. I've never played the position, but like, you have to be I think your mentality when you're a corner has to be a little bit steadier, has to be a little more resolute, because it's about your losses. You can play a perfect game for 39 snaps and get beat on a double move, and it's like you had a bad game. Whereas edge, it's totally different. Chris Jones yesterday, which we talked about on the show, is our first controversial discussion. We talked about possibly trading him. Chris Jones rushed the passer 32 times yesterday. The first 31 of them, he got 1 hurry. Yeah. 1. So you're talking about a $25 million player who made 1 play yesterday in the first 31 plays rushing the passer. He got a sack on 4th and 2 to end the game. And everybody's DMing me on Twitter saying, you're an idiot for wanting to trade Chris Jones. It's like, that's the one positive. That's the mentality you have to be a defensive lineman. To be a corner, it's you can play a perfect game and shut the guy down all game, and you give up 1 50-yard touchdown. Everybody's like, oh, he's a bum. Yeah. And so I feel like that's kind of the difference.
Well, and if I were to answer that question, I would say categorically, I would take the wayward soul as the defensive end pass rush guy.
Yeah.
I love cocksure corners, man, when they're back out there and they're on the island. They're swagger. Like, I go back to days of growing up watching guys like Lester Hayes stick them flying off his socks, and just and Frank Minifield and Hanford Dixon back in the old Brownies. Again, sorry for all this retro stuff, but I mean, even in today's world, I love it. And they have to have it, the really good ones. But man, if you don't have that edge coming off the edge, and unfortunately, I've been around some good ones, but I have, we've also missed on some for other reasons, right? I mean, I told you about the Vic Beasley thing. Vic Beasley, again, led 16 sacks in 16, killed it. But, the true passion for the game, though a very good person, it wasn't there. And in the end, that passion to get up and around the corner, play in, play out, you have to have something special about you. And of course, we go all the way back to Lawrence Taylor. Whatever he was dealing with and whatever he was motivated by while he was doing it, he got it done. And it was unbelievable. So
yeah, it takes a lot. It's like a trader, right? Like it takes a lot of gumption to go back to the well when you haven't been successful for a number of trades in a row, and to take that next one. But those are always the ones that are the long shots that hit off, right? Like when you're a defensive lineman, it's like if you have 15 plays where you're not getting pressure on the quarterback in a row, like do you quit? Do you have like and there are, and again, there are elements of that to a lot of players, and you have to be that guy that, like Chris Jones, where you go 1 for 32 or 1 for 31 in the first 31 plays of the game, and you get the sack on the last play. Like that's, there's an element there where you're like, okay, that guy's a dog, even though he wasn't effective all game. There's an element to that. Whereas again, with corners, you got to be like I think a little bit more conservative, a little bit more resolute. But again, but that is a tough position to play as well, because you have to let the losses also. The losses are more high profile, and you have to let them, fall off your shoulders a little bit. But speaking of letting some losses fall off their shoulders, we got this great game tonight, right? We have Cincinnati, we have Buffalo. It kind of reminds me, when was the last time both the Bills and the Bengals were good besides recently? Maybe like the late 80s, where they had the K-Gun, Jim Kelly offense, and you had the Boomer Esiason, Chris Collinsworth, James Brooks, Bengals fighting for it. I think that was maybe an AFC title game back in the day. But now we have, tonight's game. You've seen a little bit of money come in on the road. Buffalo Bills favored by 2.5, total on the game 50. So they're expecting some points. This is, I believe, has the most combined wins of any two teams that have ever played in Monday Night Football against each other. So this is really cool. We've talked about the Bengals already. I really like the way that they build their defense. Obviously, that's buoyed by the fact that they couldn't get a quarterback at 1. He gets injured. So then you can get a wide receiver at 5. And you get T. Higgins at third, pick 33, I think, in 2020 as well. So you have cheap guys on the offensive side, so you can buy a defense. But I thought they bought a defense about as smartly as any team has bought one in the past. Let's talk about Buffalo, though, because you're talking about being there. I think he's built a pretty damn good football team consistently, and yet they haven't been able to get over the hump, which has been the Chiefs mostly in the playoffs. Is this the year? Do they go on the road tonight and sort of like tell the world, hey, we're going to be the 1 seed in the AFC. We're going to make this thing happen? What do you think?
I do think they will. And yeah, I mean, I continue to rave about Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott as two, just the partners in it, how important that is, and their vision, what they see from year to year and where they are right now, coming off of what, happened last year. I 100% am behind these guys, and I think they go and they make a full-on statement tonight, and I'm excited about watching. I don't know what else to say about it. We talked a little bit earlier. We could talk about, some of their secondary, but I do want to talk about this game, what you're talking about here. Amazing to see that this is a game that's going to settle that first spot, right? And how it's going to play out. To me, I'd love to get your opinion on it, per the building of the Bills. And that's not easy to do. And that. I remember back in the day, just so everyone knows this, when people were thinking about if they ever would go to Buffalo, Doug Whaley was in Buffalo, who's a friend of mine. And I'm like, man, how do you get that done? How do you recruit players to come to Buffalo, snowstorms and all? That's, to me, it's, obviously this organization has proven to a lot of people out there. People want to play for this team. They pay them well, of course. But how they put things together, I do believe it comes down to a really, really good football coach and a good staff who understands the interaction between the head coach and the GM. And I know I've said that so many times with this team. So I want to toss it back to you so I don't bore the listeners on it.
Yeah, I think the thing with Buffalo is, they have built a roster so resiliently in the past, right? Where, Micah Hyde, Jordan Poyer at safety, Tre'Davious White, and then they've used Tre'Davious White in a big way, like we've talked about, where they've made life easier on their other corners. That's been, I think, a really good, they haven't had to they've had Josh Norman over there. They've had Teron Johnson over there. They took Kihir Elam in round 1. So that defense has been pretty resilient. And then they went this year, and I think in maybe the first sign, I don't mean to call this desperation in a bad way, but their first sign of we really need to win a Super Bowl, they go and get Von Miller. prior to Von Miller, no one in the front seven for the Bills over the last 3-4 years had made top 20 money at their position, right? And so they finally went in and said, we need to get a difference maker to rush the passer in the playoffs. Now, they've had some bad luck with, Hyde gets hurt. White got hurt last year. Kahir Elam hasn't been great out of Florida. And of course, Von Miller gets injured, and there's a toughness there. There's a difficulty there. Now, what they do have is Josh Allen, right? The guy, and we're going to talk about quarterbacks in a little bit, where a really solid quarterback who can overcome things either with his legs, in many cases with Allen, or with his arm, even when the receivers haven't done great. Like, they've built a really resilient team. And this year was supposed to be their year, and they still are the favorites. They're 7-2 in the betting markets to win the Super Bowl. But not everything has gone perfect. And what I really love about Buffalo is they built a great team. And they built a great team where not everything has gone right. The Chiefs and Bengals, now the Bengals have some injuries going into this game, but the Chiefs and Bengals in the AFC have been more healthy than they have been. But the Bills are still favored to win over them because they built a resilient roster that can withstand some of these issues. I think Buffalo is maybe a little weaker than the markets have suggested, just because of all the weak links that have gotten hurt for them, but they are getting healthy in the right time. And I do think they probably are right to be favored in this game. Be that as it may, I do think the Bengals are the right side if you're betting on this game. I think the Bengals are basically at their peak right now. I think they're going to run out of gas in the playoffs like the Chiefs did last year, but they've done such a good job of rebounding from a slow start to getting to where they are. I think they're peaking. I think right now they're the best team in the AFC. I think if they win tonight and then have to play Buffalo again in the playoffs at home, I think those two teams are going to be worn out by the time they get to Kansas City, much like the Chiefs were last year, having to play Buffalo and having to play the Bengals, having to really win every game down the stretch. But I think right now the Bengals are the best team in the AFC, and I think that this is either going to be the beginning of the end or the middle of the end for them this year, because I just think that their road was so hard that they're going to be incredibly impressive, but ultimately fall short of their goal of the Super Bowl.
Love it. I don't have much to add on that, brother. I look, this is going to be a fun game to watch tonight. I'm excited about sitting back in my final game of the sort of New Year's stretch. And I look forward to be just so everyone knows, when we're at home, we're usually texting back and forth on the games, trying to stir each other one way or another, or not, because of course our guy here, Eric, has strong opinions about a lot of good things. So you know that it's always edifying from that perspective.
Yeah, it's so much fun watching football with you, because obviously, you've had so much, we look at the game similarly in a lot of ways, but then differently in a lot of ways. So it's cool to sort of watch, every time I ask you, what do you think of this? And, and kind of look back and reevaluate. I admire a lot of what Buffalo has done, because in many ways, I was wrong about Josh Allen. I thought Josh Allen wouldn't be who he is. So every time you can be wrong about a player and constantly try to reevaluate your process, that's great. I like, obviously living in Cincinnati, it's been fun watching the Bengals the last few years. I think this team is much better than last year's team, even though it's very likely they won't make the Super Bowl again. It's very fun to watch them be good, because, I think that, I think it's, the town is so much more fun when they're good. But, we'll see what happens tonight. Both, if the Bengals win, the Chiefs will be the 1 seed in the AFC with a win next week. If the Bills win, the Bills will be the 1 seed in the AFC with a win next week. So there's a lot on the line tonight as well. So that's been fun. I really enjoyed talking corners with you, Thomas. I know we went a little long, but I think it was worth it. So thank you all for showing up and asking great questions. And obviously, if you like this show, go to your favorite podcast platform, subscribe, rate, review, anything there. We've got a big increase in YouTube subscribers over the past few weeks. So hopefully, that continues. And again, if you like this show, obviously refer a friend and get us here, because we'd love to be able to spread the word to more and more people. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 17 of the SumerSports Show.